There's Mrs. Kennedy, and the crowd yells, and the President of the United States.
It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade group.
John F. Kennedy died at approximately 1 o'clock.
You were doing what in Dallas?
I was the Secret Service advance man.
For 30 years, Winston Lawson has never been far from the memory that he played a key role in planning President Kennedy's fateful trip to Dallas. A young agent in 1963, Win, as he's known, often was assigned to presidential protection duties. Win Lawson traveled the world with John Kennedy and was by JFK's side when Kennedy arrived in Dallas that day. Lawson already had been in Dallas for 10 days, arranging security for the visit and approving the parade route with the concurrence of the city's police chief. Did you blame yourself?
I did in a way, but again, as I said, I knew that I had done my job. And so I wish that there had been other things that I had done or could have done, but there weren't, you know.
Presidential protection was different before Dallas. There were far fewer Secret Service agents. Rides in open limousines were commonplace. There was a mystique of presidential invulnerability until that Friday afternoon.
There were 3 shots. There weren't any more, there weren't any less. They came from over my right, you know, back of my right shoulder, that type of thing, which is where the Texas Book Depository was. I'm personally convinced that Oswald did it. Now, why he did it, were there people that put him up to it or whatever, I've no idea. However, I'm convinced personally that Oswald did it.
You know now, and you knew intellectually then, that you'd done everything you were supposed to do.
Yes. But it was still devastating to happen to you, and something that's going to stay with you the rest of your life.
Did you have nightmares?
No, I never had a nightmare. I've thought about it a lot, naturally. For years, coming across the Memorial Bridge, especially home, going home in the dark, come across Memorial Bridge and see that light flickering right ahead of me on my way to Springfield, Virginia. Yeah.
Gosh, with the Secret Service, and just so I can get this on the record, you were doing what in Dallas?
I was the Secret Service advance man, in charge of the party. In those days, you didn't have many people go out. I went out first about 10 days ahead of time, and another agent came to help me about 4 or 5 days later, because he had already been, when I left, he was on another advance in Florida.
So they hopscotch.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I'm going to mention something here, and I don't mean to be calling you down at all, but if you can avoid rocking.
Oh,
because Richard
yeah,
calls me down later if
okay,
my, you know,
I'll try.
It's going to be such a problem on Interstate 64 if you rock him. He's very moody, as you can tell. I'm sorry. So you were the advance guy in Dallas.
Yeah.
So what kinds of decisions were you responsible for overseeing?
Well, the advances in those days are a lot different than the advances in these days, for various reasons. Number one, we didn't have the personnel that we do now. So in those days, you would have 2 advancemen usually, as I said, and usually even 2 went out at the same time. However, in this particular instance and in some of the other Texas stops, I think other people joined those particular advance teams. Nowadays, there would be an overall man, and then if there's a motorcade, there'll be a motorcade agent. If there's for every speech site, there'd be a separate one. If it's an overnight, there'd be the hotel man, there'd be the airport man. Well, the 2 of us had all the stops and all the things and so forth. In those days, for normal type trips, you would use the local office, which Dallas in those days probably had like 5 or 6 people, counting the agent in charge, and which is substantially larger now. And you wouldn't bring in people from other field offices. You would use the off-duty shift, like if it was a speech prior to 3 p.m., let's say, because they have 8 to 4, 4 to 12, 12 to 8 type shifts wherever the president is overseas in the country, at the White House or in Timbuktu. And The off-duty shift always had to work extra. If you were in Washington and you were on 4 to 12s and he had some kind of a luncheon thing at the Washington Hilton, you had to work those, you know, and if it was a 1 o'clock thing, you had to be there at 11, do the deal. If you had enough time to go home, fine. If not, then you worked your 4 to 12 shift. Conversely, if he had a thing to go to, like the Gridiron Club in the evening, and you were on days, you went and worked that. Well, in Dallas or in New York or any other place, in those days when there was a presidential trip, you used the local people and you used the off-duty shift. The only people that never bothered was the 12 to 8 shift. That was hard. That was hard enough. And particularly if there were, like if he was in Dallas, well, on the Texas trip as an example, he was in Fort Worth the night before, and he was going to be at the ranch that night. So that 12 to 8 shift worked in Fort Worth and then had to be taken over to the Austin area to get to the ranch. And if it was a 6 or 7 stop overnight type of thing, the 12 to 8 shift would just have to hopscotch. Sometimes you got military flights, sometimes they had to go by commercial. And if it was from Ames, Iowa to Tuskegee, something like that, there aren't exactly, you know, so sometimes it'd take you almost all day to even get there. That's right.
It sounds like a system guaranteed to maximize overtime.
Well, yeah. So anyway, I'm sorry I digressed, but the
sounds like
the people, the people. This was a luncheon meeting. Therefore, the 4 to 12 people were going to be standing post, quote unquote. A couple of them at the airport. Couple of, you know, for the off-duty shift also in those days went on the press plane. Press plane usually would take off, like from Washington, just about the same time he did, would go like the devil to get to wherever he was going so they could land 20 minutes ahead of time so the guys and the ladies could get in the press pen and that type of thing.
Shoot the arrival.
Right, yeah. And then they would also take off usually later, just in case something happened on the takeoff or whatever.
In advance work, did you work also with the local police?
Oh, you had to. There's no way, particularly in those days, when we had very few people, that the Secret Service could operate without the help of the local sheriffs, the state police, the city police, whatever it is you're doing.
Well, I imagine even now
and now,
rely on.
And now you do too. But I'm saying because we didn't bring in people from other field offices like they do now. You know, if we had a stop like the one in Dallas was now, there'd be over 100 agents brought in from some other place. You know, as close to some people as far away as Chicago, probably.
And how many agents did you have in Dallas?
We had the local field office, and we had the off-duty shift and the on-duty shift, and that was it.
So that was what, 6, 7?
Well, no, there was more than that, but. But you know, it might be 6 or 7 on each shift, and so you're talking anything from 12 to 14 people there, a couple of bosses, and the local agents, which, you know, and so forth.
But fewer than 2 dozen.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Much fewer.
Did the motorcade route fall under the advance? I guess the advance looked at everything, right?
Yes. There would be what they called a political advance person or team or whatever, and depending on where they were going to go, and also circumstances would depend on where, you know, where the motorcade was. When it was going to be at the Trade Mart, which had a couple of buildings in those days in that area. Now they've got about 4 or 5 of them, you know, in that complex.
Convention center.
That type of thing, you know, with all kinds of things.
Well, the motorcade route was meant as a parade route, wasn't it?
Oh yeah,
and
right.
so it was published ahead of time. It wasn't like
That's
it
correct.
wasn't a security motorcade route.
No,
it was a parade
It
route.
was a parade route. And if there were 2 places under consideration: over the fairgrounds, in one of the buildings at the fairgrounds, and the Trade Mart. And the local people, in a way, wanted to kind of show the Trade Mart, you know, the powers that be. And there were some problems with the building over in the state fairgrounds. It didn't lend itself to security quite as well as the trademark did. And so it really didn't matter to the Secret Service which one was used, except the trademark really was a little bit better building for us than the one over at the women's building over at the state fairgrounds. But no matter which building had been chosen, somehow the political situation from the White House and from Texas and all that, they wanted to, you know, they wanted to parade downtown. If he'd have been going on the other end of town and out in the, somehow that parade route would have gone through downtown, you know.
So regardless of where the luncheon speech was going to be given,
yeah, it was going to be. They were going to
downtown parade route.
You aren't kidding. And since it was in noonish, you know, in that time area, that's kind of a built-in crowd type of thing. You know, people are getting out often in a political stop. People like the political people like to hit a place around noon. They like to hit a place around 5 or 6 o'clock because you get people coming out of buildings for either to go home from work or or at lunchtime or whatever. So it also helps to have a building crowd. Yeah.
It's embarrassing for politicians to have a rally and have nobody show up. I mean, we saw some events like that in the campaign that just ended actually with Miss Terry and her train ride across Virginia. But so there was going to be a parade, a public parade.
That's right.
That was, I mean, it was all published. The route was published. Was there?
And we drove that route. The chief of police. Now I must say, when you're doing an advance, depends on what's going on, and depends on. In those days, it depended on, as I say, what was going on, and also what the office was. There was a gentleman by the name of Forrest Sorrells was the agent in charge of the Dallas field office, an older gentleman. And instead of delegating authority, as could happen with a younger agent or some agent, Mr. Sorrells spent every working moment with me on that trip. And we drove the route a number of times with, again, the chief of police. That's another thing that often happens. I would bet you that if the president was going to come down to Richmond, Virginia for some type of a stop, the chief of police would not be the one running the routes. It would be a lieutenant, it might be a sergeant, it could be a captain. But either Chief Curry or one of his deputies on the 3 or 4 times that we ran that route was in the car discussing, well, now here's a railroad crossing, or here's this, or you know, that type of thing that you would do as you timed the route and as you saw the potential problems and so forth.
The route appeared, I mean, it passed muster with everybody, right?
For what it had to do, yeah.
It's been 30 years, and I'm not, you know, I don't have any brilliant questions for you, as I told you on the phone.
Of Indonesia.
Oh.
I was on a Humphrey trip there, and I picked that up in Bali.
Oh, you didn't have any shopping trips with Dan Quayle then? Remember that infamous episode in a Mexican, where was that? Was it Mexico or Guatemala or someplace where he picked the anatomically correct doll?
Oh, that's where that's from.
Are we up and running? You haven't talked with many people about this.
No.
Is it?
I
imagine it's a rather painful subject.
It's a painful subject. I have to realize that we've had one president killed since the Secret Service took over protection of a president. Secret Service started in 1860 during the Civil War, when they started out because of all the counterfeiting that was going on of federal money during the Civil War. And after McKinley was killed in Buffalo, the Secret Service really was about the only federal law enforcement agency that they had. They had a central type. There were marshals, you know, like, and so forth like that. But there wasn't a so-called group of federal investigators other than the Secret Service. So even though up to that time they had done mostly monetary type things of the federal system, it fell to the Secret Service to start protecting presidents after McKinley was killed.
No FBI, that was started in
No, that's later
the 20s
than that.
or 30s or
That's
something.
correct. And so it fell to the Secret Service, and it's been that ever since. And they gradually, it started out with a president, and then when Nixon was vice president, he wasn't protected full time. And he didn't have a regular detail. It came under the Washington field office. And eventually, they picked up former presidents. They picked up heads of state, heads of government, which in prior years had been a State Department function. Then candidates, nominees, this type of thing.
Yeah. I hope you don't mind if I ask you a little bit about that day. I mean, it's the big cliche is, and there's truth to it, I guess, because there's truth to any cliche, is that everybody remembers where he was when he got the news or when it happened. You obviously have no trouble remembering where you were.
No, I was in the car ahead of him, and an advance agent is usually in the car ahead of the president, the vice president, this type of thing. And there are other cars out ahead, to make sure there aren't ambushes and whatever, but almost directly ahead is the car that the president was in, and that was another rarity in those days. Chief Curry was driving that car, the chief of police of Dallas was driving that car, the sheriff was in the back seat, Mr. Sorrells, the local agent in charge, was in the back seat, and I was in the right front seat.
What did you hear, Andy?
I heard 3 like that, and the first one, I didn't know what it was, but soon, within a microsecond, I realized that they were shots, and there were 3 shots. There weren't any more. There weren't any less. They came from over my right, back of my right shoulder, that type of thing, which is where the Texas Book Depository was, and the word came over the radio that the president had been hit and so forth, and we got going. The president's car got going. The follow-up car got going, and so forth, and lost most of the rest of the motorcade. And as luck would have it, the motorcade went right by the speech site where we were going, which is just off the Stemmons Freeway. There's a little exit, and the local police, the sheriffs, some of the people who were, saw the partial motorcade, the presidential part of the motorcade, go speeding by and wondered what was going on, and right to the Parkland Hospital, and the broadcast, that the president hit, we were coming to Parkland Hospital, notify them and so forth, which was done. And we got there, and I got out of the car, ran into Parkland Hospital, and was met by a gentleman that was trying to bring 2 gurney type things out, and you can imagine they were going all which way if he was pushing 2 of them, And I grabbed a hold, the other end of the both of them, and we got out to the car, and people were agents, so forth, were removing the president, and Conley. Of course, they had to get Conley out ahead of him because he was ahead of him, and then on into the trauma rooms and so forth. And I was in there at first, and then later went out and was on the phone to Washington and so forth. And then you've probably heard of the flap over moving the president, and whether he should have stayed there or not, because after all, it was a murder, and there should have been an autopsy according to the local people there, and the body should be released and so forth and so on. But he was taken subsequently. His body was taken to Love Field and put on Air Force One. Got a picture of that, by the way, in here. But
President Johnson waited for Mrs. Kennedy to arrive with the body.
President Johnson was at Parkland for, well, he was still vice president then, but because he wasn't sworn in until he got on the airplane. But he wasn't at Parkland that long. He was there, until they knew that the president was dead and so forth. And then he was taken to Love Field, and he waited for Mrs. Kennedy and was sworn in then on Air Force One.
Crouching in the car, I believe. They thought initially that there might be more than
Could have been.
one, and,
People didn't
you
know what type of,
You heard the 3 shots. You're convinced they all came from
they did.
the Texas.
They did, yeah.
So you're not one of the
No,
grassy knoll.
I'm not a buff. You know, I'm personally convinced that Oswald did it. Now, why he did it, were there people that put him up to it or whatever? I've no idea. However, I'm convinced personally that Oswald did it. It'd be just too much of a circumstance with the officer that got shot and everything that happened that day to believe that it was anything other than that.
Were you involved in the follow-up investigation, the criminal investigation? I'm sure there must have been a Secret Service.
Yeah, although it fell to the FBI, and naturally there was a Secret Service internal, and of course there was the Warren report that I had to give. Various reports, my preliminary survey report and a final survey report, and had to luckily have a very good memory, but I had to kind of reconstruct everything I did in those 10 days, each meeting I was in and who was there and so forth, and which later, next advances or other times after I got to headquarters and I had other jobs, I had at 9 o'clock and at 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock and so forth, I had to write down. But I did it by memory after that.
I would imagine that in the aftermath of the shooting, I mean, that revolutionized instantly the whole advance scheme. Yeah. I mean, it did. I'm presuming that. Am I right that afterwards that Secret Service reworked a lot of its procedures? Or
they did, but what helped was the amount of the extra manpower, and it wasn't instantaneous because after all you got to train people and so forth. But gradually the Secret Service got built up, and it's a good thing because they kept getting more and more responsibilities, like the vice president and the heads of state and the candidates and nominees and so forth. But the advance parties are much larger now. The agents that are brought in from other places to help on a particular stop are, large amounts of them. And what's really something, and it's just phenomenal how they're able to do it. But you take a campaign where you've got 5 or 6 candidates, you've got maybe a sitting president and a vice president, and they're all hitting how many stops? But there's a built-in, that can be a problem, but it can also be a blessing.
Yeah, I guess.
It really can, because, if you don't know where your protectee is going, only in time enough to get cars there at least, and a few agents who know where you're supposed to go, then a planned thing. What you have to worry about in those instances really is the person that has some type of arm, knife, pistol, whatever, on their person anyway, and it's a matter of opportunity, let's say, rather than a planned deal.
So the whole advance and security scheme around presidents has changed, obviously.
It has, and what I also like to think of, because that happened, that caused other attempts to later happen. See, there was a mystique for years and years. No one can kill the president. The Secret Service is there, the local police are there, and so forth. Unless you're willing to give up your life, that type of thing, and many of them are, I suppose. But once that happened, it's my own personal opinion that, well, by gosh, maybe this can be done. There were also things that, part of that mystique that, you hear that manhole covers on parade routes are welded shut, and this, they could be now, but they weren't in those days, but people didn't know it. Again, the bulletproof car, that car was not bulletproof in those days. The bubble top wasn't an armored type of plastic type of bubble top. It was to keep rain off. Now, who knows what would have happened because of the angles and because of the curvatures and so forth. If that bubble top had been on the car, number one, it may or may not have caused the bullets to have hit. And also, there were strips of metal that, you know, it wasn't just one piece of plastic. There were strips of metal that held certain type pieces of the plastic on there. It could, you know, bullets could have hit that. If the bubble top had been on, maybe he would have said, gee, this, you know, thought in his own mind, there's no sense shooting here. I'm going to get caught because, you know, that's a bulletproof car. So
was there debate with the advance team or with the White House as to whether or not to put the bubble on JFK's?
It had been raining in Dallas that morning, and word came from Fort Worth that, you know, from the staff, if it stopped raining, take the bubble top off. I mean, most parade situations, it was decent weather, they had that bubble top off, you know, wherever you were, whether it was New York City or wherever. And word came that if it stopped raining, to take the bubble top off. It stopped raining and the bubble top was taken off.
So it was standard for him not to use the bubble top unless it was raining.
Yeah, that's right.
When you realized what was going on, I'm not going to dwell on this for the whole rest of the interview.
Yeah, right.
I assure you, but I think your personal reactions to what happened are something I'd like to explore.
Well,
a little bit.
It was devastating. Here was the President of the United States shot and killed, and it was something, unfortunately, that I had something to do with. I knew in my own heart that I had done everything, if not better than usual. In my estimation, I'd even done many things that we didn't used to do, you know, because of either time constraints, other constraints, personnel, and so forth. And one of the things that sustained me through the years was the amount of agents that came up to me and would say, Win, we know from what you used to do and what you still do that, you know, it's unfortunate that it had to happen to anybody, but if it had to happen, we know that you did what you should have been doing. And another thing I'll always be grateful to in the Secret Service was that I wasn't fired. I wasn't transferred to, there are some outfits that would probably transferred me to the boonies, you know. And I was able to eventually get up to be an acting assistant director by working and doing my job.
So they didn't run through and start lopping off
I
people's heads?
I wasn't made a scapegoat or anything, because I think it came out in the one report that I did do what we had been doing and just about everything that you possibly could. You know, again, in those days we didn't have crews who went along and did route surveys of the windows and talked to the owners of the buildings and say, please keep your windows closed and so forth. They do that now, you know. We didn't have the sharpshooters positioned on certain tall buildings that overlooked other ones. We didn't have the helicopter that now goes along routes and looks at rooftops and so forth during a parade situation. As you mentioned before about the changes, there are just a myriad of changes
well,
because
I don't think we had magnetometers
that's
to screen
right.
audiences at luncheons either.
No, they didn't. You're right.
There are just things that have
changed.
changed.
It's just a myriad of just scads of things that are done now that weren't done in those days.
You know now, and you knew intellectually then, that you'd done everything you were supposed to do.
Yes. But it was still devastating to happen to you, and something that's going to stay with you the rest of your life. You know.
Did you have nightmares?
No, I never had a nightmare. I've thought about it a lot naturally, and for years coming across the Memorial Bridge, especially going home in the dark, either, you know, in the wintertime because it gets dark at 5 o'clock, or if, you know, I was at a particular function where I'd been working in the Secret Service and would come home at 10 or 11 or 12 o'clock at night, come across Memorial Bridge and see that light flickering right ahead of me on my way to Springfield, Virginia. Yeah.
That's just that's something you can't ever get away from.
No, you couldn't.
Did you blame yourself?
I did in a way, but again, as I said, I knew that I had done my job, and so I wish that there had been other things that I had done or could have done, but there weren't, you know.
Have you seen the Clint Eastwood movie?
Yes, and
Are
I
you the
enjoyed it.
guy?
Partially, I think. They had, you see, that movie had him as part of the party, and they had him as part of the advance, and that never occurs. Now, what might occur, and thing like that is, and that happened to me. I had the advance in Berlin, and there's Ich ein Berliner Speech.
I am a donut.
Well, you know, there were a bunch of us. All right, and what happened? I heard that he had another stop in Germany, in the Frankfurt area, came to Berlin, went on from there to Ireland and so forth. And if they needed people, and if the trips were such that they could pick you up as they went by, you then joined your regular shift. Now that's what I did in Berlin. After I had been there on the advance in Berlin, which was a little bit longer advance than most of them, I went on and became a member of the working shift in Ireland. And I was, you know, my regular shift happened to be the day shift. You know, if I hadn't have been, what they would do, I'll digress again, but there were 8 to 4, 4 to 12, and 12 to 8 shifts. And if you might be working 4 to 12s and be part of it was every 2 weeks, you know, 2 weeks 8 to 4, 2 weeks 4 to you know, midnights and that type of thing.
That's tough to cope with, isn't it?
Yeah, every 2 weeks it was. Well, you would hope that if you're going to have an advance, they'd send you out when it was your turn to be on midnights, you know, and so you could get out of some of those. But anyway, you would often, maybe you should have been on 8 to 4 and you go on an advance, and when you come back, now you get picked up on the trip because they go by, and now you're on the 4 to 12s, that type of thing. I forgot what, I got digressing a little bit there, but you'd asked me something that I got off.
The movie.
Oh yeah,
and I realized,
okay. So as I was saying,
Hollywood is going to take some liberties with the actual.
That what could occur is you could be an advance agent someplace, and then on the next stop be a member of your regular shift. But you would never be an advance agent and then on the follow-up car, like he was in the movie on the follow-up car. Now, as the advance agent, you're going to be close to him because you know the most about where he's supposed to go, the escape routes, this and that. So as you'll see in
proceeding was the logical.
The car proceeding was the logical place for me to be, and the car in back of them are where the working shift agents for that particular time are. And then, so an advance agent then, when at the airport I was there as he arrived, you know, and so forth, and everything was set up with the motorcade and this, and he went over to the fence, and I was near him over the fence, but then I broke away just to make sure everything was ready and all that, the motorcade and to go. And an advance agent will be, as I say, in those days with 2 agents usually. Well, you were the site agent for everything. Therefore, you were next to him. If you got to a hotel, you were the one that led him into the hotel. If you got to a speech site or to a ballpark or wherever it was, he was following you because you were the one knowing where he was going to go. So you would be close to a president or a vice president or a head of state or a protectee in those situations, but you weren't a member of the working shift. Therefore, Clint Eastwood couldn't have been both the advance agent and on the follow-up car.
So there are technical difficulties.
Yes, but it was very close. It was very close, and I've seen many movies where they were either Secret Service or ex-Secret Service. People had either been fired or quit or whatever, like The Bodyguard or some of those other type of movies that I didn't particularly call for. But this one was very good movie.
Did it capture the torment? I mean,
it did. It did.
That I would imagine,
yes.
Not just you, but
yeah.
I would imagine every Secret Service agent and every law enforcement officer in Dallas that day has gone through a certain amount of hell.
Certainly. Yeah.
So the movie sort of captures the flavor of it
yes,
without being.
It does, and the
Did
tension.
they consult
and so
with you? I mean,
no. Although we had a former Secret Service, agent, a recently retired one who had been in public affairs when he retired, that was their consultant for about a year on the thing after he retired. And we had Jerry Parr, the name might be familiar to you. He was the agent in charge of the detail when President Reagan was shot, and is the one that threw him in the car and got him to George Washington Hospital and so forth. And Jerry Parr had since retired and was out. They had, as I understand it, much of that footage of crowd scenes and all that was this past campaign. Mm-hmm. And Jerry Parr was part of some of the filming of those particular crowd scenes that they had. So he was an ex-agent that had done that. And as they say, Bob Snow, who had recently retired as Assistant Director of Public Affairs, was really a consultant on the movie.
I'm not,
so that helped.
Yeah, I'm not obsessed with the film, but when you said you think that movie was based in part on you,
well,
I'm trying to understand. Or did you just relate to it a lot?
I related to it a lot. The person was supposed to have been an older agent who was still in and so forth. But I mean, apparently in that movie, Clint Eastwood had a lot to do with the advance, because the bubble top, for example, if you'll recall in a movie, they said, "No, why did you take the bubble top off?" And so, well, that wouldn't have been Clint Eastwood's call as a member of the working shift on the follow-up car to have taken the bubble top off. Therefore, they must have been using him as, like he had either been the boss of the thing or the advance agent or something, that type of thing. That's all I meant, but
well,
I think it was a combination of some...
The bubble top, with the removal of that was ordered by White House staff, right?
Yes.
I mean, that was not anything that you had...
No.
Did you have any decision-making in that?
No.
I mean...
No. So the Secret Service often has, after all, if you were in a totalitarian country, and I've done some advances in those, and those are great places to do an advance, because if you go to a certain city in the United States and say, will this be done, will that be done, and so after all, you're a guest there, and you have to depend on local police and the state and so forth, and things may or may not get done, and you have to depend on business owners and so forth, things may or may not get done. But you do an advance in a totalitarian country, and they say there will be no people in these buildings, there will be no, this won't happen, or this will happen, and by gosh, it'll happen. In Berlin, they did a dry run of that motorcade route and all the stops that he had there in June of 1963, even to going up to, we left at like 5 or 6 in the morning with all the buses and all the outriders and the simulated car. I mean, we had real cars, but they were simulating the president's car and the press cars and the press buses and the staff buses and everything. And we came tearing up to the Brandenburg Gate, and that plastic bubble that they had on the top of the Brandenburg Gate and other places like that, where they had the Volpo and the Eastern Bloc people and all that. Must have scared the devil out of them, to see. They probably thought an invasion was coming. But
I guess totalitarian nations are a little bit easier to handle as a security.
Absolutely,
And is the Richard and I talked with the guy who was, I mentioned him to you briefly, he was Kennedy's Virginia campaign manager. Mm-hmm. You always try to look for some sort of a lesson, and he said, yeah, well, if somebody wants to get somebody and is willing to sacrifice himself, it could happen.
Yeah.
You think that's true?
Depending on the type of thing that they use, but because there are so many changes and so many things, like you mentioned with the magnetometers, and as I said, they've got the counter sniper teams and up on tops of buildings, and helicopters that go along to look, that type of thing. And they do, because of personnel and because of technical advances, they're able to do so much more than we were able to do 25 and 30 years ago.
But is it possible to totally protect a president?
Well, I don't think I'll answer that.
I don't believe it. I don't believe it.
I would hope so, and I know that they will give their all to do it, but I don't know.
Yeah. Is there anything you'd like to add? before Richard shoots?
I don't think
Cutaways.
so. Can't think of anything.
You said you didn't blame yourself. You knew you'd done everything.
Yeah.
If you've been able to find peace.
Pretty much, I get, you know, when it comes the anniversary, or like I said, those times that I'd be cross Memorial Bridge and see the flickering light, or I might see a program or something like that on TV that would remind me. But yeah, pretty much.
Do you ever go up to Arlington?
Yes. I was there. I went on the 25th anniversary, and I've been a few other private times.
That must be tough to visit that spot.
And if I have or now that I don't live there, but when I used to live up in the area, and we'd have guests from out of town, and they would want to go to Arlington Cemetery or something, I would go, and it would be a special moment, you know. But I've been there privately other times, you know.
A tough moment.
Yeah.
I want to get some cutaways, please.
Well, I'd have to look it up in the Warren Report and all that, but at least
Repeated.
3 to 4, yeah, repeated times, you know, yeah. And, you know, and then to the, I mean, we did the advance at the airport, and we did the advance at the speech site and so forth. You know, we had to go around and, okay, we'll have an agent here, and we'll have some local police there, you know, like you would do in a normal type of advance. There really were only, there were 4. You know, you got an arrival, you've got the motorcade to the speech site, you got the speech site overnight.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't have 2 or 3 speech sites. It didn't have like the $1,000 a plate.
Yeah.
Or, you know, you didn't have the $1,000, you didn't have the reception, you didn't have a speech, you didn't have he was taking, this is President, is it Mexican or Peru? President Prado, is it? Yeah, President Prado of Peru, over to the Blair House. And he was supposed to go to the Kitty Hawk on one of his trips, and this was one of their
sailors.
Yeah, that's right, and this is one of their top deal. And all the arrangements were made and so forth, and we'd been there. Even had the Kitty Hawk come in and tie up so we could see how much of a yeah, because
Yeah. See, some of the subtleties are
that's right.
lost on a layperson.
Yeah.